3 years ago, I made a video speculating about the possibility that overproduction could kill Pokemon. Well, not kill it entirely, but anyway, this concept known as the Bullwhip Effect is an economic term explaining how an unanticipated spike in demand can lead to overproduction of a good until eventually that very good becomes devalued. Now, if we rewind the clock back to 2022 when I initially published that video, we'd see modern products sitting on store shelves, unable to be sold, and when it did sell, it was selling for significantly below MSRP for several years. Now, I think this makes perfect sense when paired with the Bullwhip Effect. And to think about the Bullwhip Effect, it's really like a game of telephone, where with each successful iteration, it morphs further and further out of control. Consider, if you will, a world in which Pokemon demand was highly elevated. Shocking, I know, right? But anyway, this would prompt retail stores to order more product than what they actually needed due to limitations on allocations. Meanwhile, distributors would order even more product from manufacturers, knowing that there is high demand amongst their retail stores. Finally, the manufacturer would have to ramp up production to meet all of the demand that was out there for consumers, stores, resellers, and investors. With each phase, the production wave would grow bigger as each entity accounts for more demand than what actually organically exists. And before you know it, the market is saturated with products, leading to devaluation. Now, this brings us to the big question of the video: will overproduction kill demand? And there's been a number of videos that I've encountered here in the PokeTube sphere with people debating this question, and I do think there's some historical data and some indicators that we can look to for some foresight into the future. So anyway, I invite you all to join me for this one. I'm Pokemon Classics. Let's roll the intro. Hey everybody, what's up from Pokemon Classics, reminding you all that the classics never go out of style. Today's video is a speculative one, but I wanted to examine modern Pokemon and ask the question, will overproduction lead to its devaluation? Now, I know this is a controversial topic, so as always, I welcome your thoughts, opinions, and commentary down in the comments below. But for today's video, I wanted to break it into 3 sections. First, we'll examine the most recent printing update for modern Pokemon. Then I wanted to take a look back at some historical data, looking at market cycles, the trends, the history, and see what sort of insights we can glean from that. Finally, I wanted to talk about the Bullwhip Effect and how saturation of a product can influence its demand. There's one universal truth out there, it's that there's a constant battle between supply and demand, and I think that's something that will inevitably play out again here in the future. Anyway, guys, let's take it into our printing update. Alright, so last week, the Pokemon Company released its production numbers for the year 2024 to 2025. Now, quick disclaimer, this data is taken from March of 2024 to March of this year in 2025, and I think that's an important point that a lot of people have overlooked when examining this data. Now, what we've found, though, is in that year, Pokemon printed 10.2 billion cards, and that is a mind-boggling, just staggering amount of cards, but it is less than the previous year, which is really interesting given how inaccessible cards have been over these last 6 months. In fact, if we take a look at a chart for the previous printing going all the way back to 2020 during the pandemic boom, we'll see that the amount of cards printed has increased gradually every single year up until this last year. So what happened in the last 12 months? Why would Pokemon produce fewer cards given the market insanity and the high demand that we're currently seeing? Well, I think it's important to keep historical context in mind when making sense of these numbers. What I have for you here is a graph taken from Google Trends with the search term Pokemon cards, and it goes all the way back to 2020 and all the way up to present day. Now, we'll see some ebbs and flows on this graph, some spikes, including the pandemic 25th anniversary boom in 2020 over on the left, but then also in October of 2024 with the release of TCG Pocket, as well as the latter half of the Scarlet and Violet era, which seems to be massively popular. One of the interesting notes on this graph, though, is when I released my video about production numbers, and this was shortly after Pokemon announced that it would be ramping up its production. What we saw during that era is in the years that followed in 2022 and 2023 is that sales were significantly down. Products were sitting on store shelves, readily available, and many of them were selling for below MSRP online and in store. In fact, as you can see from this chart, Scarlet and Violet base was selling for below $100 per booster box, and that was true of several other Scarlet and Violet sets as well. And it wasn't just those, this was also for some Sword and Shield products, fact, we had the Charizard UPC, which is doing really well right now, was also selling for about the $100 mark, and this was an extended period of time through 2022 and 2023. So it would be fair to say that Pokemon was in a bear market, and that seemed to correspond perfectly with the production numbers of Pokemon increasing. And going back to our chart, you can see that downward trend continued throughout much of 2023 and most of 2024, with really the only exception being a temporary spike for Scarlet and Violet 151. And it wouldn't be until October of 2024 before things started to pick up again. Again, this video is speculative in nature, but I think this demonstrates two things. First, there is an implementation lag. It takes a while for production output to reach the end consumer due to a number of steps that have to happen in between. Second, I think this demonstrates a principle of market psychology, that there is a relationship between supply and demand, that as production increases and supply becomes saturated, it flushes out a lot of the parties who weren't authentically interested in Pokemon to begin with, resulting in devaluation. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. For those of you who have watched this channel for a while, you've heard me talk about market cycles, but the more engaged you are in Pokemon and the more experience you have, the more you start to recognize some of these market patterns. Now, we've been through this cycle a number of times, going back to the Pokemon Go phase in 2016, the pandemic hype of 2020, and now whatever we want to call this, the investment boom, the Scarlet and Violet era, here in 2025. But every one of these has been preceded first by a growth phase, a hype phase, and then eventually a subsequent correction or a down phase. And I think we're seeing this cycle play out once more. Back in 2016, Pokemon was being driven by extensive media hype and the release of Pokemon Go, a global-wide phenomenon that had everybody, and I mean everybody, thinking about Pokemon. It also had the 20th anniversary of Pokemon, so we had all these factors coalescing into making Pokemon incredibly popular. And some of that attention came to the card game, and that was noticed in price as well as demand. However, as interest in Pokemon Go and the 20th anniversary faded, so too did a number of the users and players and collectors that initially jumped into the Pokemon Trading Card Game space. In fact, if you guys have ever watched Alpha Investments, Rudy, this is the time that he put together his Pokemon bathroom out of spite. He had ordered massive numbers of products and was unable to sell them because all that euphoria, the interest, the demand just wasn't there anymore. So he shut up the door to that bathroom and let it sit for a few years before Pokemon would enter another productive upswing. But that would take a while. Many of you watching this channel were around for that upswing, and that was the pandemic boom of 2020. Now, once again, this was fueled by media hype with all sorts of influencers this time, jumping in for box breaks and selling cards through live streams. We also had stimulus checks, and that was a unique situation as well, with thousands of dollars being placed in the average consumer's pocket. And then we had another celebration, this time the 25th anniversary of Pokemon, so all the stars aligned to make perhaps the largest Pokemon boom that we have ever seen. For those of you who weren't around, we had celebrities like Katy Perry and Post Malone actively involved in the Pokemon franchise. Meanwhile, we experienced unprecedented level of demand, along with product shortages, scalping. Even McDonald's wasn't safe at the time, and in that way, it really bears resemblance to what's happening today. Now, they say that hindsight is 20/20, but after the pandemic boom, we saw prices for products and individual cards absolutely crater, some of them dropping by as much as 50 to 75%. In fact, I have the graph up here from Google Trends next to the graph of a typical asset bubble, and the two look surprisingly similar. Should have seen this at the time, but I gotta admit, this took me by surprise, and perhaps that'll be the case here in 2025 as well. Speaking of 2025, how does it stack up with today? Well, once more, we're seeing a social media influence through streaming, through celebrities. We have product shortages that are taking over in retail spaces and online stores, including the Pokemon Center, and we have unprecedented levels of interest from people of all swaths of life cramming into the Pokemon market. Also familiar is this message from the Pokemon Company stating that they would be printing more Pokemon cards to meet demand, a message that they've sent out several times now, most recently in January. So the question becomes, how much product will the Pokemon Company actually be producing, and how long will it take for that product to actually circulate into our existing Pokemon market? Because remember, there is an implementation lag, and the last time Pokemon announced that they'd be increasing production, it took at least a few months, about half a year actually, before that product was widely circulated and was enough to satiate demand, before we saw products return to store shelves and scalper activity diminishing. Considering interest in Pokemon cards was declining up until about October of 2024, those numbers we saw earlier about production are likely not taking into account the increased production numbers that Pokemon is likely to produce in 2025. In short, I think Pokemon might be increasing production as it's exiting a boom. And if so, that's a perfect recipe for saturation. Finally, let's talk about the Bullwhip Effect. Now, right now, we're stuck in a continuous feedback loop with high levels of FOMO, product inaccessibility, price inflation, and then all sorts of scalping and reselling happening on the market. And this just intensifies from one level to the next, and there really is no end to it unless something breaks it. And supply is the one thing that can quickly disrupt this cycle and turn it around. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Bullwhip Effect is triggered by an increase in consumer demand, incentivizing new stores to be created and existing stores to place larger and larger orders. Meanwhile, producers are incentivized to expand their manufacturing process to meet all of those orders and fulfill the level of demand that's currently on the market. Let's say, hypothetically, that the Pokemon Company does increase production in 2025, taking it from 10.2 billion cards last year to 12.7 billion cards this year. More importantly, let's hypothesize that Pokemon cards are regularly available once more on the Pokemon Center website and available in person at most big box retail stores. Will demand decline once products are more accessible? Now, this is a philosophical question about the role of scarcity in determining a product's price, but I do think there's some market psychology at work here, especially when we consider the role of all three types of market participants. First, we have the collectors and the players, and these individuals are going to maintain interest in Pokemon cards regardless of what prices do. However, we also have the investors, and I do think that this is going to sift away a large number of the investors out there. The smart ones will stick around, they'll be buying products at or below MSRP when it is accessible, but I think the vast majority of investors are more opportunistic and more susceptible to following the crowd. Then we have the scalpers. This is actually a very large segment of the purchasing market right now, but these will be neutralized entirely. When products are once again accessible, there'll be no profit motive, no incentive to buy and flip products instantaneously. If this all plays out, we'll have a higher level of production than ever before and a significant drop in market participants. And when you put those two together, that is a recipe for saturation and devaluation. We've seen it before. Again, the question is, when will this happen? And that's where I welcome your thoughts and opinions down in the comments below. Some here on YouTube have been arguing that the early signs are already here, with Prismatic Evolutions undergoing multiple reprints, including a new Costco package that's to be released soon, and prices dropping. We've also seen 151 reprinted several times over with the Blooming Waters package, and several other reprints hitting store shelves. Meanwhile, we've had sets like Journey Together that have fallen relatively flat of expectation, and that being further fuel to suggest that maybe Pokemon's starting to wear off. However, the counter-argument to this is there are several highly anticipated sets still around the corner, like Black Bolt and White Flare. These sets are incredibly popular, and I know it's going to bring back a lot of the nostalgia for all the people that grew up with Black and White era of Pokemon. There's also the 30th anniversary just on the horizon, about 7 months away, and as we've seen in the past, that's been a catalyst in 2016 and 2021, so will this time reasonably be any different? I don't know. Personally, I do think we're beyond the peak interest of Pokemania 2024 and 2025, but these things take time. There is an implementation lag, and I don't think we run the risk of falling over an immediate cliff anytime in the next few days, weeks, or perhaps even months. In fact, I'd go as far to say that I think Pokemon will remain very strong going into the 30th anniversary, and perhaps at least a little while beyond that, but that's just my opinion. Again, I welcome all of your thoughts down in the comments. Thanks for sticking around for this one, everybody. I'm Pokemon Classics, reminding you all that the classics never go out of style. Till next time, don't forget to have fun, enjoy collecting. That's really what this is about. Bye, everybody.